Good evening, everyone. Really is a great honor to speak to you this evening. And as Rabbi Lowenthal said, I'm here in the holy city of Sfat. And please come to visit. Hopefully we'll be through with the COVID and all of this difficult times, and you'll be able to come to Eretz Yisrael, and you're more than welcome to come and visit. And this is a Jewish invitation, not a British invitation. So it's really from the heart. Please really show up, really mean it. I have a little bit of just a few minutes. I want to share a bit of background so that you can understand how I came to be born into the predicament and the circumstances that I was born into. So both of my parents have now passed away. My mother was a Sephardic Jewess who was born and raised in Alexandria in Egypt. The family originated in Spain. We know there was the expulsion in the 1490s, and then they went to southern Italy for a couple of hundred years. They were expelled again. They went to the west coast of Greece. There was a blood libel in the 1890s, and they fled to Alexandria. So my mother was actually born in Alexandria, but she was never given Egyptian citizenship. She was holding a Greek passport when she went to England to marry my father. My father was born in a small town in England, in the middle of England, in Northamptonshire. He was raised on a farm. When he was just 16, he signed up and went to war, and he was fighting in frontline combat during the entire duration of the Second World War. For 2.5 of those years, he was in the British Army in the 8th Brigade with General Monty. And when he was fighting in the Battle of Al Alamein, when he was on leave, so he either went to Cairo or to Alexandria. Now, my Jewish grandmother, she knew 10 languages fluently. Both of my Jewish grandparents knew 10 languages fluently. Those who knew my grandmother said you would never guess that she was not born and raised in England her entire life. She spoke such a beautiful English. Consequently, she took a job teaching English in an extremely prestigious school for boys there in Alexandria. The headmaster was from Scotland, and it was run by the Salvation Army. What my grandmother was not necessarily aware of was that the headmaster hired his deputy headmistress to befriend the Jewish school teacher in an effort to convert her. My grandmother worked over 25 years in the school, and slowly, this friendship grew. And eventually, unfortunately, my grandmother did convert to Christianity. And my mother at the time was the eldest of 10 children. And she was almost 21 years old. And my grandmother also persuaded her and influenced her to convert to Christianity as well. Now, my grandfather, who was quite religious, was very devastated with this turn of events. And he actually sat Shiva and said the prayers as if his wife, my grandmother, and my mother had died. And they lived separately after that time. It was only after that my parents met. Now, the headmaster of the school opened his schoolrooms in the evenings to the servicemen, Christian boys, who were able to visit in Alexandria, and so they could have church services and spiritual strengthening during the time of the war. So who did my father meet there but the Jewish lady and her daughter? They became engaged, and my father promised my mother that when the war ended, he would send her a ticket to England where they could marry. This took another 3.5 years, because after the victory of the Al Alamein battle, they went through Palestine and then on to Europe. And my father was one of the Allied soldiers liberating the camps, and he was liberating especially the Bergen-Belsen camp. And then finally they arrived in England. So it was in October 1946 that my mother boarded a boat. It took her 6 weeks to go from Alexandria to Southampton in England. In order to marry my father in the church, she was baptized. And in November of 1946, my parents were married. It was, I think, due to the entire um, brutality and cruelty and death that my father had seen during all of the years that he'd fought in frontline combat for the war, that I think it really had a very deep effect on him. Very often he told me many stories. He would always put us to bed at night with stories from the war. And he often mentioned how he had really, really good friends, and he felt that they were very, very good people, even better people than he was, but they didn't make it through the war. And I think this left an impression on him that he wanted to contribute something to the society and make this world a better and kinder place, not just for himself, but for the friends that he lost. And so my father decided that he was going to train and become a Pentecostal preacher. This took another 4 years. And when my father was finally ordained, my parents had 4 children. This was their planned family. It was quite a lot of years later when my mother realized she was having another baby. And that was me. So I was the unplanned child and the mistake in the family. I think after I left the church at the age of 25 and embraced Judaism, that my father really had second thoughts that maybe I really was the mistake in the family. But anyway, at that time, by the time I was born, so my father's congregation was well established in a small town in England called Loughborough, Leicestershire. There was no synagogue and no Jews. It's important, I'm sure all of you do understand, in Scandinavia, it's very Christian dominated. So you understand that the Christians go through the father and not from the mother. So the fact that my mother was a Jew held absolutely no weight in our home whatsoever. And also it's important to understand that my mother never spoke one word ever of anything about her life in Alexandria before her conversion. I did not know the most basic things about Judaism at all. I had never heard of Shabbat candles. Unfortunately, I didn't even know that Shabbat started on Friday evening at sunset and it finished after the sun went down on Motzei Shabbat on Saturday evening. I had no idea of Yom Kippur. I had never heard a shofar. I had no idea what a shofar was. I didn't even know what mezuzah was. Literally the most basic things that even the most assimilated of Jews knows about. I had absolutely no notion of these items or mitzvahs or anything at all. But what I thought I did know about a Jew was that they had dark skin and black hair. And what happened? Oh, so they had dark skin and black hair. This is what my mother looked like. As I mentioned, she was Sephardic. My father was blonde as anyone could be, extremely fair skin and blue eyes. So all of us children were fair in complexion. And I realized quite early that I could not be a Jew because I absolutely did not look like my mother. So I actually grew in a very, very strict Christian environment, as my father was the preacher. So we had a very open home, and our entire life and world centered around church. I went to very strict Christian schools. We started every day with hymns and prayers. I was not allowed to read any secular literature. Um, we had no television, no radio, no newspapers. And we went to church almost every night of the week, twice on Saturdays and 3 times on Sundays. Now, I know this sounds extremely austere, but I was actually a very, very happy little girl. I was very happy, very proud of my father and my parents, and especially proud of the doctrines of the church, and deeply respected my parents and the way that I was raised. So it wasn't a conflict for me. And from a very young age, I wanted to totally dedicate my life to God. And I really wanted to be as close to God as was humanly possible. And I used to pray that when I was a little girl, and I would each night kneel down and before I went to sleep by my bed, and I would pray my normal night prayers, and then afterwards I would always say, dear God, when I get big, I'm going to work very hard and I'm going to earn a lot of money and I'm going to give it all to you. And I really, really had this very innocent desire to totally dedicate my life to God. Now, that doesn't mean to say I was some little saint. I was plenty creative as a child, and got into quite a lot of mischief, but it was always good fun, and I was quite a lively member at school in my classroom and a lively little churchgoer. So, but by the time I was 16, my father had a very close friend that he'd also gone through the war with, and also he was in the British Air Force. My dad was in the army, but they were stationed also around Palestine, Alexandria, and around this area. So, um, actually, he knew my grandparents, especially my grandmother, during the war years, and had visited it in my grandmother's home. And so even though he was quite a big preacher with a big church and congregation in the city of Nottingham, um, we called him Uncle Peter. I always called him Uncle Peter, and we was very, very close. So he had begun when I was about 10, 11 years old. He, besides, in addition to his congregation and church, a theological college, to take in young people, to train them how to work and to train them for the mission field. He'd watched me growing up, and he suggested to my father when I was just 16, why wait until Tony is 18? He said, I think it's a waste. I think she's really ready to begin her spiritual training now. Why don't you send her? It's important to understand that my father did not coerce me in any way. But as I said, this was my lifelong dream. And from when the college opened, I volunteered for many days and weeks in my summer holidays in the college, either in the print shop, in the kitchens, wherever, and it became almost like a second home. So when my father suggested that I want to begin training in the college, so it wasn't a big change for me, and I was actually very excited, and I knew quite a lot of people in the college already. So, but I think my father, when he drove me over to the big city of Nottingham, and the college was in a beautiful, like, Victorian mansion surrounded by very pretty English gardens and a massive high wall and a huge iron gate. We were sitting outside in the car, and my father looked at me and he said, are you sure you want to do this? He said, you can change your mind. He said, you're so young. You don't have to be pressured to do this right now in your life. You can do it later. And I remember I felt so grown up. And I looked at my father and I said, Daddy, I am ready. And he said, all right, I will take you in. It didn't take me long to quickly understand that being a student in the college was quite different to volunteering. The principal believed that unless a person's spirit was broken, unless they were deadened to all natural desires, they would never be of use to God. In order to attain this lofty goal, we were presented with a book of rules. The first rule was that we had to be obedient to those in authority over us. It did not matter what we were told to do, no matter how embarrassing or humiliating, we had to instantly do it and without question. We had to eat anything that was put in front of us. This was in order to train us that food was not to derive pleasure from, it was merely to satiate our hunger and to give us energy. That does not mean to say that the food was bad. We had a very good cook. She was actually Hungarian in her cultural background, and she was an excellent cook. But sometimes she was ordered to burn the food, and we had to eat it. Sometimes, at least once a week, we were served moldy crusts of bread. We also had to fast a lot. We had to fast one day every week for 24 hours, and we were encouraged to fast on 2 separate days. In the 9 years that I spent in the college, I always fasted 2 days on Mondays and Fridays. In addition, the principal would call upon us, the entire college, to fast together every few months for 3 consecutive days, sometimes 5 days, and once every year for an entire week. The longest fast I ever did was 8 days. Now you can ask, how could that possibly be? That how can anybody survive that long? And that is a good question. But when we were doing the 24-hour fast, we were not allowed to have fluid. But when we were doing the longer fast, obviously you cannot keep going. It's extremely dangerous. You must keep yourself hydrated. So during the long fast, we were allowed to have a drink that we called milk and water. It was rather like an English tea with a little bit of milk in the bottom of a teacup with one tiny teaspoon of sugar and then boiling water. We were allowed to drink as many milk and water drinks as we wanted. We were not allowed to lie in bed. We had to physically keep going with our regular work schedule. Um, it's not easy. You like on the third day, I think something happens to your gastric juices and you think that you're going to die. It's really an uncomfortable day on the third day. But when you get past that, it's like your stomach settles down and realizes it's not going to get anything. So it stops demanding so much from you. And then you can keep going. It's very hard. You're very weak. You have to be careful when you lie down to sit up because you can pass out. It's not so simple. But I'm just explaining all of this because I want you to understand that um, even though this sounds very, very austere, that I know it sounds strange, but I was actually very, very excited with this program because I truly believed 2 things were going to happen to me. I thought I was going to become a better person. I thought I would be more refined, more sensitive to spirituality, and I would be closer to God if I disattach myself from the physical materialistic world. And this was something that I really, really wanted. And I know that it sounds strange, but I actually adjusted very quickly and I was very, very happy there. After I'd been there a couple of years, one of my older sisters, she arrived to begin her training. All of my elder brothers and sisters, they first completed their secular education and then came to the college to do certain amount of time for spiritual training. I was the only one that was the little zealot. So my sister was put in a completely different wing to me with completely different responsibilities, and we never had any free time. So really the only time that we were able to like wave or smile to each other was during the church services. We weren't even necessarily sitting together. We had to sit where we were ordered and not together. So even though she'd been there about a month, I'd actually hardly seen her. One day it was a Wednesday, we were in the queue in the line for dinner, inching our way into the dining room in the evening. And as we were inching our way forward, she whispered to me and she said, "Hey, do you know what day it was today?" So I said, "No, Margaret, it was a regular, ordinary day. It was Wednesday. So what was so special about this Wednesday?" And she whispered to me and she said, "It was Yom Kippur." I looked at her and I said, "How do you know that?" She said she was at work and she saw all the Jews going to the synagogue and she couldn't understand why were the Jews going to the synagogue in the middle of the week. She decided there must be a war. Something terrible must have happened here in Israel. And she said, "I didn't know." My mother had 2 brothers who came to here to Israel and fought in the 48 war, and they settled here in Israel and married Sephardic wives. So she said, "I wanted to see if Uncle Sammy and Uncle Solomon and the family in Israel was all right." So in my lunch break, I decided to go in and I asked them, "What's going on? Is there a war?" And she said, they told me, "No, everything is fine. Today is Yom Kippur." Okay, she said, "Thank you very much." She didn't know anything really about Yom Kippur. We all knew that Jews fasted on that day. But she went back to work, she ate her sandwiches, continued her work, and she came home and told me. Now, I was so flabbergasted. I'd been in the city of Nottingham for 2 years, and it didn't even occur to me to think about a Jew or a synagogue. And she'd only just arrived, and she seemed to know so much. And I looked at her and I said, Margaret, synagogue? How do you know that there's a synagogue here? So she said, hey, you didn't know? And literally, no, I didn't know that a 5-minute walk away from our college was an Orthodox synagogue. Now, as we know, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in Europe and also especially in England. And so the synagogue was a large, majestic building, but there wasn't any billboard outside that gave any notification that that was a synagogue. Only my sister said, when you go inside, there's a huge lobby, and then you'll know that you're inside a synagogue. I looked at her, she's the same complexion as me, and I said, Margaret, didn't they look at you and say that you're a Gentile? She said, no, first of all, there were crowds of people there. She said, you can't believe how many Jews there are in this city. The place was packed. And she said, you know what? There's even Jews with blonde hair. And she said, if you're so interested, why don't you go and have a look sometime? No one will bother you. Okay, we never had too much time, as I mentioned, to socialize. We took our dinner, we sat down quickly, we ate our meal, and she went her way and I went mine, and we had to prepare ourselves for the evening service. Now, my roommate had not yet come up from dinner, and I remember I was in the room alone. I was just pottering around and tidying up a little bit, but I will never forget that day. All of a sudden, all I could think was, it was Yom Kippur. All the Jews were in synagogue and you weren't there. Together with these words, they seemed to spring from nowhere in my mind. It like released in the very gut of my being such a deep feeling of sadness. It was almost like this depression descended on me, feelings that I'd never experienced in my entire life. I was always a very happy, fun person and cheering everyone. And all of a sudden, this heaviness descended on me. And I remember I literally clenched my fist and made my arms rigid by my side. And with all the strength I could muster in my mind, I told myself, so what? So what if all the Jews were in synagogue and I wasn't there? I wasn't supposed to be there. And what on earth have the Jews got to do with me? Try as I might, no matter how hard I tried to push these words out of my mind and these feelings away from me, they seemed to hammer me back even harder. Now, it seemed to me so weird and so strange that I didn't even share it with my roommate, not with my best friend, not with anyone. But as you can imagine, I was literally like panicking a little bit inside and just trying to clear myself and free myself from these feelings and thoughts. As I remember, it took me a good 2-3 days to totally forget about it. And I was quite relieved when it just left me and my mind was clear again. Now, we had 2 services on a Saturday. One was at 12 noon and one was at 7 in the evening. Now, we had a little bit of free time on a Saturday morning. It wasn't free to do what we wanted. We had a special program of inner reflection, Bible study, and it was a time of self-purification. So as it was an individual time, it was actually a very easy time to sneak away. So this one Shabbat morning, Saturday morning, I tried to persuade my roommate, who of course was not Jewish, to come with me for a walk. And let's go to the synagogue, I said. And I told her, you know, Margaret went, and let's just have a look. I really want to have a look what a synagogue looks like inside, but I'm really too scared to go by myself. So why don't you come with me? She said to me, synagogue? I'm not going to the synagogue, she told me. And you shouldn't go there either. Don't go. I told her, come on, what could be the harm in it? We don't have to say anything. We don't have to do anything. Let's just have a look for 2-3 minutes. Come on. So she told me, I'm not going, and listen to me. You shouldn't go there either. Don't go, there. It's not a place for us. We don't belong there. Don't go. Okay, I saw she was getting a little bit antsy. I told her, okay, don't worry. There was a beautiful park just literally around the corner from the college, and we were allowed to go there and do our inner reflection and meditations. So I told her, you know what, I'll go to the park and I will do my reflections and program and Bible study, and I'll be back later. But of course, I knew where I was going to go. Now, as I mentioned, I was extremely naive. I lived an extremely sheltered life. And in the church, we were not allowed to wear contemporary dress. So actually, even though we were Protestant, I looked exactly like a Catholic nun. I was wearing a dark brown, almost black, like a headscarf that came almost to my eyes. It wasn't like a tickle that the religious Jewish ladies wear when they're at home, but it came past my shoulders. We had to be covered all the way up to here, this bone here, and then long skirts to the floor. We had very stiff starched petticoats. Actually, we had 4 layers of clothing, and none of our body shape was allowed to show. So I always laugh and say I looked more like a walking tree trunk than I did a human being. But anyway, as I said, I was very naive, and my sister gave me very clear instructions. But I don't think it ever really dawned on her that I really would go to the synagogue. So she forgot to tell me a very important detail about upstairs and down. And so I innocently walk in and sat down in the men's section. Well, of course, I hadn't been there more than a couple of seconds, and sat down, and the entire davening, the prayer stopped, and everyone turned around and they're staring at me. And I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I went in very quietly. I sat down very nicely, but everyone was just silent and staring at me. And I'm looking at them, they're looking at me. And so finally I smiled, and then this elderly gentleman came over and he said, "I'm sorry, but you have to leave." I was like, good grief, what's wrong with my face? My sister told me no one bothered her. Okay, I went out, and the gentleman escorted me out. And when we were in the lobby, I said, "You honestly mean that I can't stay here?" Poor guy. I mean, you have to understand, there wasn't a thing about me that day that would give the remotest hint that I was a Jew. And I myself didn't know that I was a Jew. But anyway, so he explained, okay, the women go upstairs. Okay, my sister had gone on Yom Kippur, packed crowds of people. This was a regular Shabbos, and I went upstairs. There were 3 ladies in the synagogue. Then I was a little bit more cautious. I realized that there was names on every seat, and I couldn't find my name, and I didn't quite know what to do. And there was books on the window ledge, so I took one and I perched myself on the edge of the seat. I really only wanted to know what happened. So what happened, I'll tell you. We stood up and we sat down. We stood up and we sat down. And it was all in Hebrew, and I didn't know what on earth they were talking about. I stayed only a few minutes. I was maybe 5-10 minutes, and on one of the ups, I put my little book back, and I went running out of there and running up the hill back to the church, and I was quite relieved, and I figured, whoa, no wonder my mother left. It's really as I was taught my entire life. It's just dead religion and ancient traditions, and there's nothing there for me, and I'm never going there again. Well, I threw myself into my life in the church with renewed vigor and renewed enthusiasm. And as I'd started only at 16, I was already ordained, and I wasn't even 21. I finished my first degree then. And it was a very high time for me. My father was extremely proud of his baby girl. I'd reached a higher height in the church than any of my older brothers and sisters, and at such a young age. Now, what was the vow that I'd taken after my ordination was that I would never marry, and I would stay with the church until I died. And I thought it was an amazing thing to do with my life at that time. Now, about 6 months after my ordination, I received a letter from my mother. We were not allowed any personal phone calls. We did not have any holiday. I was not given any money, but we were allowed letters. My mother wrote to me and she said her youngest brother, my Uncle Sam, who lived here in Israel in Kiryat Shmona, was coming to England on holiday. Now, Uncle Sam was not religious. Uncle Sam knew that his father, my grandfather, had sat Shiva for my mom, but he was in England, and who knew if he ever would be in England again. And in fact, he never did go to England. And he wanted to meet his sister. And not only did he want to meet up with her, but he wanted to meet her family and her children. And my mother explained that I lived in a church. And my uncle said, no matter, listen, please ask her, tell her I will not go into the church, but maybe she could meet me in the gardens and we could have a conversation for a few minutes and she can meet her uncle from Israel and I can meet my niece. You have no idea how excited I was. Like I said, we weren't given any holiday. I wasn't given any money. I didn't think I ever would have an opportunity to meet my mother's family living here in Eretz Israel. And I was absolutely thrilled. And the principal tuned into this excitement. He knew when my uncle was arriving, I had to get permission. And the day before my uncle arrived, he called me into his office and he told me very sternly, I'm just warning you, child, that your uncle just might offer you a ticket to Israel. You know what to say, don't you? Okay, I understood. And I remember leaving in his office and I'm thinking to myself, I could still be happy that my uncle is coming. My uncle arrived when it was just the two of us. We were sitting on a bench together in the gardens and he looked at me and he said, Tony, what are you doing here? What are you doing behind these high walls and wearing such dark clothes? He said, don't you know that God gave life to be lived, to be enjoyed? He said, come on, cheer up a little bit, laugh a little bit. He said, you know what? I'll send you a ticket to Israel. Why don't you come? Oh, I told him, Uncle, that's so kind of you. But it's too late. I have given my life to God. My uncle, being very Jewish, was not going to be put off with any of this nonsense. So he starts telling me everything he can think of about life here in Eretz Yisrael. And it's the 70s. He's talking to me about kibbutzim and turkey factories. And he was one of the pioneers. He'd come in 48. They'd paved roads. They'd planted trees. And he's explaining everything about how developed and how everything about Eretz Israel. He was so proud of everything, and rightly so. And all the time he kept telling me, Tony, come to Israel. He said, you'll be like one of my own daughters. I'll take care of all of your needs. I'll buy you anything at all that you want. Just come. And I told him, Uncle, it's so kind, but my life is no longer mine. It's too late. He told me, you know what, Tony, I have to tell you the truth. Life in Israel, especially where I'm living in Kiryat Shmona, it's not so easy. He said, we're surrounded by two hostile Arab countries from Syria and Lebanon, and the Katyusha rockets come raining down, and we have to take the children from their beds, and we run to the shelters, and we take them from their school, and we have to run to the shelters, and we lose our water, and we lose our electricity, and it's cramped in the shelters, and it's very, very crowded, and it's not very comfortable, and sometimes we have to stay in the shelters for even a week at a time. And he said, actually, my eldest daughter, he said, that's your cousin Nomi. She's married and she has little children, and she's been living also with us for the last 4 years in Kiryat Shmona also. But he said, whilst I'm here in England on holiday, Nomi is moving further south. She's had it with life in Kiryat Shmona. She wants to raise her children in a calmer environment where they're not all the time worrying about sirens and bombs. And he said, you know what I'm looking forward to do? As soon as I get back to Eretz Israel, even before I go to my own home, I'm going to visit Nomi in her new home, and I will put a mezuzah on the outside of her house. He explained to me this is a Sephardic custom, that when a child moves to a new home, it's the father that puts the mezuzah on the outside. And he kept telling to me, I cannot explain to you how much pleasure this is going to give me to do this for Nomi. Well, I asked him, Uncle, what's a mezuzah? I'd never heard of one, definitely never seen one. He explained to me it's a pretty box, and inside is a piece of parchment with part of the Jewish Bible handwritten on it by a scribe. And he told me religious Jews have it on every door of their home, and they kiss it when they go in and out. Right before he left, he looked at me and he said, you know, Tony, I see you're not going to come to Israel, but I want you to at least own something. I want to send you something from Israel. Think of anything at all that you would like from Eretz Israel, and I am going to do my best to find it and send it to you. I thought for a short while and I said, you know what? I think I would like a mezuzah. I want to see what is this thing that you're so excited about that you're going to put on your daughter's home. Can you please send me one? I want to see it. I want one too. Okay, sure enough, about 10 days later, a small padded envelope arrived for me in the church. I was very excited. I want us to understand also the amazing divine providence of this little mezuzah. I told you my uncle was not so religious, and he was extremely traditional and had a deep, deep love for Israel. But he didn't really have patience for all the things that mitzvahs and stuff that Jews are supposed to do. He didn't really have patience for all of this. So, but he could have sent me anything. Really, like I said, he could have, years later when I went to visit him in his home, he had little tiny wincey mezuzahs on his doors, but he went out and he purchased a full-size kosher mezuzah. And he left the back open of the little box, and so that I could see the mezuzah scroll inside. He drew a diagram so carefully, so neatly as to which doorpost, how far up, at what angle, all the instructions of how to put the mezuzah on the door. Now I took the mezuzah to my room, and I remember sitting in my room in the church, and I took out the little scroll and I held it in my hand, and I thought, whoa, what are you supposed to do with it? Are you supposed to open it? But it seemed to be wrapped up so carefully. I figured I'd better not touch it. So I put it back in its little box. That night after evening prayers, it was about 10:30 at night. Now, when we were not fasting, we were given a cup of hot cocoa. Instead of going into the dining room for my cocoa, I quickly hurried down to the cellars of the church and I rummaged around, and yet I managed to find a hammer and some nails. And I quickly ran back to my room, which I shared with two non-Jews at that time. And I took my uncle's letter and I made sure to do everything just perfectly. And I banged the mezuzah on my door in the church. And my uncle told me, you're supposed to kiss it. And I kissed it. And all of a sudden, I remember I got so scared. I figured, whoa, I got so excited with this little thing. I forgot to ask permission first. But I remember looking at it and thinking, but what could be wrong with it? It's only a piece of wood, and it's only a piece of parchment. I figured the only thing I could possibly have done wrong is that I didn't ask permission first. I figured, okay, I'll take it down quickly. I'll run to find the principal, and for sure he will say yes. I find him, it's about 11 o'clock at night, And I'm very excited. I'm bouncing up and down. And I tell him, look, my uncle, he sent me a mezuzah and it's from Israel and it's so pretty. And can I please put it up? He didn't say anything. He just put his hand out at arm's length and I pop it in. He said to me, just look at it, child. I said, I'm looking at it. What's wrong with it? He told me, what's wrong with it? Tell me, what's nice about it? I said, actually, what's nice about it is that my uncle sent it to me from Israel. And could I please put it up? He said, no. The Jews have this for superstitious reasons. We don't believe in that kind of rubbish. He said, no, you cannot put it up. But he gave it to me back. The only place I had at that time in my life, in the entire universe that was just mine, was a little bedside cabinet with a tiny little drawer. I popped my mezuzah in my little drawer, and I'll tell you the truth, I forgot about it. I do not remember once ever taking that mezuzah out again and looking at it. But I want us to think for a couple of seconds now. Where was I at that particular time in my life? Unfortunately, I was in a very dark, low place for a Jew to be. I had no idea I was a Jew. At that time, I'm a good Christian girl. I have good responsibilities in the church. I'm very happy, very successful. But what comes into my possession at this time in my life is a little kosher mezuzah with its eternal message that there's only one God. I am surrounded by idol worship, idolatry. I live in a church. But each night when I lay down to go to sleep, that little kosher mezuzah with its eternal message is right next to my head. Over 3 years go by. I grew tremendously in the church. I had a huge amount of responsibility, as I mentioned. I was very, very successful and very well loved and respected. One day, I was out for my morning devotion on Saturday morning, and I went past the synagogue. I must have gone past the synagogue during those years dozens of times. I did not look at it, acknowledge it, nothing. And honestly, until today, I have no idea why I walked past the synagogue that day. And I stopped. It was something spontaneous. And I decide I'm going to go into the synagogue. I remember I didn't even turn around. I walked backwards 4 steps and I went into the synagogue. I knew to go upstairs this time. I sat at the back. I didn't look at anyone. And I'd only been there about 2 or 3 minutes. And the rabbi went to the front of the synagogue, to the Holy Ark, and he took out the Torah scroll. And he held it and turned and faced the congregation. And what does he say? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And at that point in the service, the congregants repeat the words that the rabbi says. And I remember standing there and thinking, whoa, that's really cute. All you have to do is copy what the rabbi says. And I remember thinking to myself, whoa, even I could do that. I stay only a few moments. I was afraid someone from the church had seen me enter or would see me exit. I quickly get myself back to the church. Now, each Friday evening, a roster is posted on the college notice board with everyone's duties for the weekend services and the services the following week. Sometimes you were not on the weekend. The next time that I was not on weekend services, I decided I had clear conscience. Of course, I didn't tell anyone. And I decided I'm going to go back to the synagogue. I'm going to go exactly the time I'd gone previously. I want to see, was this a one-time thing that the rabbi did to take out the Torah, to take out the scroll? Or does he do this every week? Does it happen all the time? So I go back and sure enough, the rabbi took out the scroll again. And again, he said, Shema. And this time I was ready. And I tried as carefully as I could to repeat the words that the rabbi had said. And for the first time in my life, I was 23 and a half years old. I acknowledged that there was one God. I had no idea what I'd said. There were no great feelings inside. I stayed a few minutes. I went back to the church. But the next time I wasn't on the weekend services. It could be several weeks later, it could be a month or two later. But I went back to the synagogue again. And each time I went to the synagogue, I always made sure to get there at that particular time. So what happened? Slowly, slowly, that little tiny Jewish spark that was buried so deeply inside, it started to wake up. It was almost as if for almost 24 years, my little Jewish soul was in some kind of spiritual coma. All of a sudden, I start saying Shema. Now I have no idea what I'm saying, but my little soul, my little neshama, it knows exactly what I'm saying. And it gets very excited. And it starts to blink its little neshama eyes. And it wakes up. And the only way that I can describe to you how it made me feel was that it awakened a longing in the very gut of my being just to be with Jews. That's it. I want to look at a Jew. I want to sit among Jews. I want to look at the rabbi. I want to look at the Torah. I want to hear the words of the Torah. Something in the very gut of my being is so drawn. But the stronger these feelings become, the more concerned I became. And I felt like I was almost becoming addicted to the Jew. Why? I couldn't understand it. One day I was standing there in the synagogue and I got a little firm with myself. And I said to myself, what are you doing here? Take off these rose-colored glasses, I told myself, and look at this for what it really is. This is dead religion. This is ancient traditions. What you have in the church is life and freedom. And I told myself, yes, I'm never coming here again. And I really meant it. And I went back to the church and I hurried and I went to the inner sanctuary and I knelt down. Instead of going to my room first, I went straight into the inner sanctuary in the church and I started to sob and to beg God, please forgive me and help me. And I don't know why I keep thinking about Jews and why can't I forget about them? And I'm so sorry. And I know I'm a good Christian and I want to be a better Christian and I'm an ordained minister and I stand at the pulpit and I preach and I want to be sincere and I please help me to get rid of these Jewish thoughts and these Jewish feelings and to concentrate and to be a good Christian. When we were served burnt food, I ate more. When we were served moldy bread, I ate more. I fasted more. I did everything in my power to disattach myself from the materialistic world and to completely give myself over to the Christian values and the way that I was raised. But it was too late. My little neshama had woken up and it had no intention of going back to sleep. And those Jewish feelings and that deep longing in the gut of my being would become so strong that all I could think about, no matter what my duties were in the church, in the day, in the week, and whatever, was that I wanted so badly. I thirsted just to look at a Jew, that's all, to look at a Jew, to sit among a Jew, to look at the Torah. It was an ache, a pain in the gut of my being to hear the words of the Torah. And it would become so strong that I would sneak to the synagogue again. One day, I stayed in the synagogue too late, and I was late for our service back at the church. The principal called me into his office, and he asked me, "Where were you?" I was afraid to tell a lie. I said I was just in the middle of my devotions, and I went past the synagogue, and I don't know why, but I went inside, and I'm so sorry, and I won't do it again. He went mamish ballistic. He started to scream at me. He thumbs his hand down on his desk. He said, "I am telling you, child, you are a Gentile. God says you are a Gentile. The Bible says you are a Gentile. And you have to tell yourself every morning when you get up 3 times, I'm a Gentile, I'm a Gentile, I'm a Gentile." And every night before you go to sleep, the very last thing on your mind will be, "I am a Gentile." He said, "Do you understand?" He banned me from ever going to the synagogue again and from having any contact whatsoever with a Jew. Honestly, I told myself, this is what's wrong with me. And for the next year, over a year, each morning when I woke up, each night when I went to sleep, I told myself over and over again that I was a Gentile. But nothing happened, as we know. Nothing changed. And one day I sat up in bed and I said, who cares? Just say, for some bizarre reason, maybe I'm a Jew. I'm not going to say this anymore. We don't have time for me to tell you the whole story. I'm sure that Rabbi has told you that I do have a book. It's called To Play with Fire. It's almost 400 pages. So I don't have time to tell you everything, but it was another, just over a year later, I was 24 and a half years old. I was on preaching the main sermon. I'd been in the college for 8 years. I remember exactly where I was standing in the church. I took my Bibles and study books down to prepare my sermon. And that day I felt so clearly that I had grasped everything there was to grasp of the Christian God. He was right here in my hand. And I remember I said to the Christian God, I understand everything there is to understand about you, but what else? I can explain to you and tell you from my own experience, there's a vast difference between spirituality and godliness. If a person, any person, Jew or non-Jew, chooses to disattach himself from the materialistic world and seclude himself either behind high walls, in a convent, in a monastery, in a Christian theological college, or in a ashram, or on the mountains of the Himalayas, and live a minimalistic life, there is spiritual energy in this world, and one can tune into it. It will make a person feel good. I can promise you, if you ask any one of those monks, nuns, or priests in any of these places, why do you live? Why do you choose to live your life like this? That every single one of them will tell you, it makes me feel good. A Jew, on the other hand, we have an added dimension. And we will never feel that sense of fulfillment. We will never feel that sense of completion until we connect with God in a uniquely Jewish way. And this is through learning the Torah and through the mitzvot. I did not understand any of these things. At this day, I still have absolutely no idea that I am a Jew. I'm just trying to connect with God. And I know that I've had many, many spiritual experiences, but it's led me into a vacuum. And I cannot find God within that spiritual experience. And for the first time in my life that day in that church, I said to myself, is there really a God? Or have I just been brainwashed all of my life? Maybe I'm so heavily indoctrinated about hellfire and eternal damnation that I'm afraid not to believe all of this stuff. Here again, it was one of those moments where I have no idea why I thought what I thought that next moment, other than it was my little Jewish soul popping up and speaking. Because the very next thought I said to myself was, there has to be a God. And if there is a God, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham's God, I told myself. That's the God I have to find. And from that moment on, when I knelt down in that church for hours at a time, I ate every single day. I no longer prayed to the Christian God, and no one knew. But I prayed only to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If only you could hear me now, please hear me and lead me to all truth, whatever it might be. Now, actually, this time now is a very, very special time for me. Why? Because this time 40 years ago was when I was on my knees in church, praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to please hear my voice and help me hear my prayer, and please help me to find you. Well, I don't know if you know, but this year, Passover, the Seder night, will begin on Saturday evening, on Motzei Shabbat. And in 1981, that's exactly the same situation. Passover was starting on Motzei Shabbat. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson in Brooklyn, he asked his emissaries exactly about this time. He had a gathering, what was called a Verbrengen, and he asked his emissaries the world over, please print a leaflet explaining the halachas, the laws of Passover for this particular year, that Jews will not innocently come to make a mistake. And of course, Lubavitch in headquarters in London, they arranged and they printed a leaflet. And the Rebbe kept emphasizing that it should be widely distributed. Now, what happened? So we know that very often the Jewish holidays coincide with the Christian holidays. And so it was in 1981, a Passover time. The Passover coincided with the Easter holidays. So we were having a week-long convention in the church, and we had missionaries coming from all over the world. And actually we had a group of Christian missionaries coming from Norway. I'm sure some of you in the audience that have connected with us this evening are from Norway, from Oslo. And so we, their particular missionary work, unfortunately, was to convert Jews. Now, they were very well disguised. They were not Jewish. No one among them was Jewish, but they were very, very well disguised. They had beards. They knew to cover their heads. They knew a lot of Jewish traditions and customs. They even knew some Hebrew. And they had befriended a Jew in Oslo, a real Jew. And they told him, we are going to England to keep the Passover. And he innocently explained to them, listen, I don't know if you know, but this year it's a little bit different and the laws are a bit more complicated. He gave them the address of the Lubavitch headquarters in London, and he told them, listen, This group of Jews usually takes upon themselves to explain and make sure that Jews know exactly how to keep the holidays properly. So here's the address. On your way up to Nottingham, why don't you call in to the Lubavitch headquarters in Stamford Hill, and I'm sure they'll have some information to help you. Do you know how expensive it is for a taxi? It's so far away to go from Heathrow Airport to Stamford Hill. They took a taxi and they went into Stamford Hill headquarters of Lubavitch, and they said, Shalom Aleichem, and we are Jews and we came from Oslo in Norway. What was on the side? Some of these leaflets and pamphlets that the Lubavitcher Rebbe had asked to be written and printed. And they picked some up and they brought them to the church. Well, as I mentioned, I was not allowed to take one, and the entire college and congregation knew that Sister Joy, as I was called in the church, was not allowed to have any contact with anything Jewish whatsoever. Of course, I desperately wanted a leaflet. The entire week, I'm chasing these Norwegians around the campus. Every time I think I have them, somebody came and sat with us. It was very frustrating, but I didn't give up. The last 20 minutes of a week-long convention, I cornered one of the Norwegian ladies, literally with her coat on, suitcase in her hand, rushing to a waiting taxi outside to take her to the train. And I got her and I said, Sister Frida, do you have any more of those leaflets? I'm sorry, dear, she said, I don't. Honestly, I don't know what it must have looked like, because she put her bag down, her suitcases, and she gave me a giant hug. And she said, it's all right, dear. I have one and it's mine. But if you really want it, I'll give it to you. She rummaged in her bag. She gave me the leaflet and she was gone. And all of a sudden it struck me what I had in my hand, and I ran immediately to my room and I stuffed it under my mattress. And it was from that leaflet, there was an address at the bottom, that I managed to secretly be able to get in touch with a Lubavitch rabbi, who put me in touch with a wonderful Lubavitch family in London. And I ended up staying with them for 9 months. But I would like to close this session, if Rabbi will allow me to have a few more minutes. Rabbi Lowenthal, is okay? Can I have a few more minutes? I just want to tell 2 special stories in conclusion, please. Is it okay?
Great, and then we're going to do questions. Yes, super.
Yeah. All right. I just want to, so I arrived in the home, and I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. And of course, as you can imagine, it was very, very strange. I had literally nothing but the clothes I stood in. I literally ran away with nothing but the clothes I stood in. Anyway, they were exceptionally kind to me, and really, really helped me. But when it came to the Friday, so the mother of the family, she explained that it's a custom for Jewish girls and women to light a candle on Friday night when the designated time when Shabbat comes in. She said, listen, there's no pressure whatsoever. We understand that everything is very, very new and strange, and please do not feel pressured in any way. But listen, I'm going to put a candle out. If you would like to light it, it's fine. And if you don't, it's absolutely fine also. Do not pressure yourself. Okay, I said thank you. But by the time it came to the middle of the day on Friday, I was getting very afraid. I don't know why. I just was like very nervous. And I'd been there already almost a week, and I totally decided that I'd made a huge mistake and I shouldn't have run away from the church, and I had to get myself back. But I decided I'll go through this Shabbat and I'll prove to myself that there's absolutely nothing in it first before I return back to the church. During the course of the afternoon, this very nice lady, mother of the family, kept asking me, would you like to take a shower and wash your hair? Now, she had 7 children. The eldest was only 8, and they'd graciously taken me into their home. And as you can imagine, there was lots of things to do. So in my mind, I was thinking, well, when Shabbat comes in, I'll take a nice hot bath and I'll wash my hair and blah, blah, but I didn't say what I was thinking. So I kept telling her, it's okay, I really don't mind to help you. I'm happy to help you, it's fine. I'll help you some more. So finally, we get the whole house really sparkling, and she must have asked me at least a half a dozen times, even more, like 8, 10 times. All the time, she kept saying, "Please, there's plenty of hot water. The bathroom is free. How about now?" And I kept telling her, "It's all right. Please don't worry. I'm fine." Okay, finally, she makes an announcement. "Okay, children, it's time to light Shabbat candles." She was in her Shabbat clothes, and the children were all bathed, and everybody was ready. The house was all sparkling. We go into the dining room, and there's quite a lot of commotion, and the children are really excited. Who's going to say the blessing for me to repeat after them? Now, I'm going to prove to myself there's nothing in this. So I think to myself, I don't think much of this. I said, this is a religious home, and isn't this the holy Sabbath? Aren't we going to do something holy now? Well, I was a little bit confused if we're going to do something holy in the church. So it's silent, and we kneel down, and then we slowly play soft music and work up an atmosphere and get into it a little bit. But it was just so hectic. Everyone's calling to the other one, "Turn these lights off, turn these lights on, put away car keys, cover telephones." And there's all this rumpus with the children. Okay, we go into the dining room. They give me a little match. They tell me, light your candle, wave your hands 3 times over the flame. I was very embarrassed. I go like this. And she tells me, "Please repeat the words that one of the children is saying." And I mumble my way through. And she tells me, "Good Shabbos." I said, "Oh, good Shabbos. Well, finally, is it all right if I take a shower and wash my hair now? Or a bath?" She said, "Oh, I am so, so sorry." She said, I just asked you so many times before because we don't take a shower or wash our hair on Shabbat. And I really thought you understand. I'm so, so sorry, but it's too late now. There's nothing that we could do. All I could think at that moment was my father telling me when I was a child growing up, "Always remember it's the first impression that counts." And I figured, she's going to take me to the synagogue looking like this. It's not my fault. She should have explained it better. And I was so frustrated. And I said to myself, I am still going to take a shower and wash my hair. I was really frustrated. I go stomping up the stairs, 3 flights to my little room on the very top of a beautiful large home. And I opened the door to my room, and I was just about to barge in, because that's what you do when you're really, really frustrated and upset, right? I literally jumped back. There was such a peace in that room that was so thick, you could almost touch it. And I jumped back, and all I could say was, "My God, God is here." I stood on the landing, and I realized the entire house was filled with this peace. Now, I told you I'd had spiritual experiences, many in the church, but nothing remotely compared with the intensity of that peace on that first Shabbat. And I stood there on the landing, and I said to myself, I only lit a candle. But the amazing thing was, I didn't understand it at the time, but that's all I had to do. For the first time in life, I did a mitzvah. And whether you nice ladies, you take a few minutes and you light a little wax candle at a designated time on a Friday night, or you nice gentlemen, you take 5 minutes of your day and you put on tefillin and you say Shema, or we put a coin in a charity box, or we say a few words of prayer, or we learn a little bit of Torah. What happens to us? Actually, what happens is that deepest little Jewish spark, that little pentala yid, it connects totally with the most highest part of God. it synchronizes us. It was the first time I connected with God as a Jew. But I want you to understand something really, really important, because when I lit that little candle, I didn't believe it. I didn't think about it. I didn't even believe I was a Jew. I was very, very confused at that time in my life. But the very act of doing that little mitzvah, of lighting that little candle, even though I didn't believe it, at that designated time was still enough to connect the most Jewish, deepest part of myself to the most highest and holy part of God. And I didn't want to take a shower or wash my hair. I didn't want to do anything that would disturb that peace and make it go away. And I didn't want to go back to the church. I had to find out, what had these people done to find God in this way? What did I have to do? There's one more story I want to share with you. When I was 18, I was 2 years in the college, and my mother was found to have cancer. She was 47 years old, the same age. Her mother had the same ovarian cancer in Egypt and passed away from it. She was rushed into hospital. She had 2 massive heart attacks during the surgery. It was a private, very top quality hospital, and a Catholic hospital. All the nuns and doctors were devout Christians. And the next morning, they said to my father, "Don't even thank us." They said too many things went wrong. There were blockages, she had heart attacks, and we have no idea why your wife is still alive today. In their own words, they said it was a miracle. And everyone figured it was a miracle, and me too, that the Christian God made a miracle. My mother fully recovered. The only thing she asked to be called after that surgery was by her Jewish name of Sarah. Until she died at 85 years old, my mother was known in the church as Sister Sarah. As I said, she fully recovered and never had a relapse. 7 years later, 9 years altogether, I left the church. I stayed 9 months with this wonderful family in Hampstead Garden suburbs in London. And then I knew I wanted to build a Jewish home, and I wanted to do it properly. And I wanted to learn Torah in depth. I came here to Eretz Israel. I found the Babbage school called Machan Alta that was willing to take me, even though I was way behind the other girls, and to give me a trial and a chance. And I came here and I learned. It was after another almost 2 years that I met my husband. He has an amazing story of his own. My husband is a convert to Judaism. He was raised in the Episcopalian Church. He was the chief altar boy. He used to carry the cross and light the candles. And he has his own journey of how he himself, by the time of 18 years old, he came here to Eretz Israel alone with a one-way ticket. He did not know anyone. He had no address. He didn't have any Jewish relatives or anyone in his family, but he wanted, as myself, to pursue truth. He was learned in Kibbutz Sad. They had a special program for Gerim and converts to learn of Judaism. Rabbi Avad Yosef took a special interest in him, and he actually oversaw the entire Ger. He was 5 years in Or Sameach. Then he wanted to learn Kabbalah, and they told him, "Oh, you want to learn that stuff? You have to go to Sfas." He came up here to Sfas, and we had a house mother. She was from Los Angeles. He was from Sacramento, also in California. When she had him over for a Shabbat lunch and she heard his story, she said, "Oh boy, do I have a shidduch for you." Okay, cut a long story short, we decided to get married. Now, I know that if my father would know, he would be very, very distraught. And so I told my husband, I think it's really better that maybe we don't tell my father right now, and we'll just get married, and somewhere along the line, we'll break the news. Okay, cut another long story short, we got married and I didn't tell my parents. Then several months later, I realized I'm having a baby. And then when I was about 6 months pregnant, I figured better tell my parents I got married. I wrote a postcard home. I'm having a nice time in Israel. The weather is wonderful. P.S. By the way, I got married. My sister Margaret, she calls me up and she tells me, listen, I'm just warning you. Daddy and mommy have booked tickets to Israel and daddy is livid. She said, he cannot believe that you dared to do such a thing. And he's so disgusted with this so-called husband of yours that he didn't even have the decency to ask for your hand in marriage. Anyway, daddy and mommy are coming to Israel to see who this person is. Okay, they come, they stay with Uncle Sam, they make it their business to come to Sofed for one day to visit me and my husband. Baruch Hashem, thank God, my husband, very knowledgeable, was sitting with my father. They had actually a very respectful and cordial conversation in our little living room. And I went into the kitchen to make food and my mom tiptoed in and she whispered, Tova, do you know what prayer I said when I was on the operating table? This is my mother. First of all, it was over 12 years by this time since my mother's surgery. And as I said, she'd fully recovered and I'd totally forgotten that she'd ever been sick. Not only that, by this time, my mom had been married to my father for 40 years. She's baptized into the church. She's the preacher's wife. She sits in church almost every night of the week for 40 years. She's never mentioned one word ever of anything Jewish. And I look at my mother and I said, Mommy, I don't know. I don't know what prayer you chose at that moment, but you could have said one of many. And my mother whispered, I said Shema. Because when it came down to an issue of life and death, and my mom was lying there on that operating table, two things she knew. She knew who she was, who she really was, and she knew who was her God. And that's what I want to leave you all with this evening. I want to encourage every single one of you. You are so special. You are so special to God, so dear to him like his most cherished jewels. Cherish that part of God that's deeply embedded inside each and every one of you. Dare to explore it. Dare to embrace it. And dare to connect to the highest part of the only one and only eternal God. God bless. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic, very beautiful and moving. And I think we might have a couple of questions. Hope that's okay. And I'm going to take one over here. If anybody else has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And over here it says the Christian canon contains numerous debates about the theological differences between Judaism and Christianity. Before your conversion to Judaism, what were your views on these debated matters? After your conversion, meaning after your returning to Judaism, have you ever defended the Judaism's perspective on these debated matters to your former peers?
That's a very good question. Actually, we were not really taught Judaism in depth at all when we were in the church. It was just different aspects of Christianity. People have often asked me why I did not really refute Christianity more strongly since I left the church and do have quite a knowledge of everything. But honestly, for many, many years, I think now it's after 40 years that I'm coming to the place where I would be more comfortable to begin to refute Christianity. But I definitely haven't tried to persuade any of the people that I left behind in the church. They are not Jewish, and I don't really see that there's a reason to try to encourage them to convert to Judaism. I think that if he felt it, and they would come of their own accord. On the other hand, as I felt that I've tried very hard to strengthen, especially our young people, and to strengthen Jewish identity within Jews so that they would be able to appreciate who they are and not need to look for spiritual fulfillment in other places. And I really do feel that I've had a lot of effect in those areas. So I'm more concentrated on that aspect of everything in the beginning, but I do feel that I will begin now also with my husband to refute, or explain the authenticity of Judaism to Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews and people like that. I do feel that there's a need for that.
I have a question, which is historically the church has been a bastion of anti-Semitism, some areas of the church, but nowadays we also see certain Christian different Christian groups that are very pro-Jewish or Israel evangelicals that are very pro-Jewish. In your experience growing up, did you experience it as anti-Semitic or pro or neutral regarding this topic?
That's a good question, because I think honestly that every type of Christian really is uncomfortable with Jews being Jewish. And I think that there's the Methodists and Baptists that feel that Jews have horns, and I think that they're very, very anti-Semitic, and definitely Jews are from the devil. You have also the Catholics. The Catholics believe that if any one of their congregants manages to convert a Jew, then their entire family is saved from Gehenna, no matter whether they're murderers or thieves or anything, but just the fact that they got a Jew into the fold, so they're given eternal credit according to their religion. I think that the basis of all the conflict comes from the fact that Christians want to say that they are the Son of God. Once they believe in Jesus, so then that brings them to a level of being called the Son of God. But then the Jews are very stubborn. So wherever the Jews, there's only can be one Son of God according to their belief. So then that Jews discredit that belief. And so that's an annoyance. Now the Pentecostals and the Evangelicals, they feel that the Jewish people have a veil in front of their eyes, but in the time of the second coming, then that veil will be lifted. So they feel that all become Christians at the end of day, and they're a little bit more patient. Even though I was raised with evangelicals, and they outwardly were promoting like this so-called love towards Jews and a warmth toward Jews, but when the Jewish spark, or in a certain way, that the priest, the head Galach of the college where I was, he saw the Jew in me. I didn't see the Jew in me. I didn't know it. But he saw it very, very clearly. And every time it popped up, he squashed it out in a second. And he was very, very sharp about that. So there's never, in fact, I heard a priest once talk and say, when Jews convert to Christianity, they do so in a completely unique way. And I think that Christians understand that when a Jew converts to Christianity, he's never totally wholly Christian. It's impossible. Like you see with my mom, you know, like when it comes down to it, something from who she really is pops out now and then. And those who are in charge and they're knowledgeable about this, they see it. And so a Jew is never allowed to identify in a Jewish way and be totally accepted within the church. It will never happen, not anywhere.